everyone, and thanks for checking in. Today we have a, slightly dated document from 2020, but I decided to pull this legal sidebar and read it with us, because that'd be kind of interesting to see exactly what the old Justice and Policing Act was like before we ended up passing the Justice Act. So, like I said, it is from 2020, but this should give us some background on how things have changed, and hopefully it'll be of interest to someone else who likes criminal justice stuff. So yeah, George Floyd died in the company of the Minneapolis police after an officer pressed a knee while restraining him. The incident, others like it, and subsequent nationwide protests have sparked heightened interest in the federal government's ability to prevent and remedy police misconduct, especially the use of excessive force against people of color. The events of May and June 2020 prompted action by the executive branch and legislative proposals in both houses of Congress. On June 16, 2020, President Donald Trump issued an executive order on safe policing for safe communities. And on June 8, 2020, members of the House of Representatives, led by the Congressional Black Caucus, introduced the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act of 2020, the Justice in Policing Act. And on June 17, 2020, Senate Republicans unveiled the Just and Unifying Solutions to Invigorate Communities Everywhere Act of 2020. The Justice Act. A previous legal sidebar briefly summarized the executive order in both bills along with other recent reform proposals. This legal sidebar provides a comparison of the Justice and Policing Act and the Justice Act. While this sidebar does not purport to detail every provision of the two bills exhaustively, it analyzes key similarities and differences that are most relevant when evaluating the two proposals. Sidebar first outlines subject matters both bills cover, detailing similarities and differences between each bill on those subjects, and it concludes by discussing provisions unique to each bill. And yeah, it's updated June 25th, 2020, and is current as of that date, so I can't tell you whether or not the stuff stayed in, got withdrawn. And I was wrong, it's not the before and after, they're actually two different acts and two different sides of the Congress. You can tell we're getting into the end of the day. Alright. This section outlines subjects addressed by both the Justice and Policing Act and the Justice Act. In addition to addressing some of the same topics, the two bills are broadly similar in that many of their provisions regulating state and local law enforcement would rely on Congress's power under the spending clause to require states or state and local law enforcement agencies to accept federal funding to implement certain policies as a condition of the grant. Primary sources of federal funding to which the bills would attach conditions are grants under the Brian JAG program and the COPS grant program. In general, whenever either bill would impose an obligation on state or local governments to accept federal funds, funding recipients who fail to comply with such obligations would become ineligible for some or all funding from the specified sources. However, various provisions of both bills would directly regulate federal and even state and local law enforcement officers. So, the limitations on chokeholds, everyone's favorite thing. And by the way, I've been watching like old reruns of Cops, and they've been using that hold for a long time, so just saying. Both the Justice and Policing Act and the Justice Act include provisions designed to limit the use of chokeholds by federal, state, and local law enforcement, though the two statutes differ in their breadth and approach. Section 363 of the Justice and Policing Act would specifically govern chokeholds or carotid holds, defined as the application of any pressure to the throat or windpipe, use of maneuvers that restrict blood or oxygen flow to the brain, or carotid artery restraints that prevent or hinder breathing or reduce intake of air. That section of the bill requires states or localities that receive certain federal funding to enact laws banning all uses of chokeholds and carotid holds by law enforcement officers. As discussed further below, Section 363 would also amend 18 Code of the USC, Section 242, to criminalize the use of maneuvers based on race. Yeah, see, that... I'll just start getting to, like, subjective qualification. I'm like, let's not do that part. Maybe nobody get a chokehold. How about that? Section 364 of the Justice and Policing Act, entitled the Peace Act, would prohibit federal law enforcement officers from using chokeholds or carotid holds unless the conditions for deadly force discussed further below are met. Really? We have to get the deadly force conditions out? Ooh, alright, I'm sorry, cops. The Justice Act would apply to chokeholds defined as a physical maneuver that restricts an individual's ability to breathe for purposes of incapacitation. Section 105 of the Justice Act would require states and local governments to receive certain federal funding to develop law enforcement agency policies prohibiting the use of chokeholds when deadly force is authorized, except when deadly force is authorized. That section would also require the Attorney General to develop such a policy at the federal level for federal law enforcement agencies, aka the DEA and all those fun folks. With respect to the use of force more broadly, the Peace Act, Section 364 of Justice and Policing, would allow federal law enforcement officers to use deadly force, defined as that force which a reasonable person would consider likely to cause death or seriously bodily harm, specifically including chokeholds and carotid holds, use of a gun, multiple discharges of a taser. only as a last resort to prevent imminent death, serious bodily injury when there is no substantial risk of injury to a third person, and reasonable alternatives to the use of deadly force have been exhausted. Or less lethal force, defined as any degree of force not likely to cause death or serious bodily injury, only if such a force is necessary and proportional to effecting arrests supported by probable cause, and reasonable alternatives to the use of less lethal force have been exhausted. The Peace Act required federal officers to identify themselves and issue certain verbal warnings to a suspect prior to the use of any force when feasible. That would be nice, and you see that a lot of cops already. Failure to abide by applicable standards concerning the use of force would limit the ability of a federal law enforcement officer charged with murder or manslaughter to argue that a killing was justified. The section also directs the Attorney General to issue guidance and provide training to federal law enforcement officials on the use of force more generally. Finally, this section conditions certain federal grants to states, municipalities, and Indian tribes. Oh, they said Indian tribes. Great. Thank you, 2020. Recipients enacting laws to establish comparable use of force standards. The Justice Act does not contain a comparable provision restricting the use of deadly or less lethal force more broadly, but as discussed below, would require reporting of incidents involving law enforcement uses of force. Okay, so you can do it, but then you have to talk about it after. No-knock warrants. The good old no-knock warrant. We need to, stop swatting, by the way. Can we just agree to stop that as, a society? I used to think it'd be funny when I was younger, but no. Alright. Both bills seek to address concerns related to the use of no-knock warrants by the Justice and Policing Act would impose or encourage direct legal limits on the practice, while the Justice Act would instead seek to gather data on the use of no-knock warrants. Let me tell you, they're quite popular. Section 362 of Justice and Policing Act would ban no-knock warrants in drug cases at the federal level. The section would also condition certain federal funding upon states and localities enacting laws prohibiting the use of no-knock warrants in similar drug cases. The Justice Act does not contain a comparable provision banning no-knock warrants, but as discussed below, would require reporting on their use. Body cameras. Both bills would seek to increase use of body-worn cameras by state and local law enforcement. Justice and Policing Act would additionally require use of body cameras and in-vehicle video recording by federal law enforcement officers. Ooh. Yeah, you can see that one definitely came from the House. Alright. Title 3, Subtitle C of the Justice and Policing Act requires certain federal law enforcement officers to wear body cameras and use such cameras in responding to any call for service or at the initiation of any law enforcement investigative stop between a federal law enforcement officer and a member of the public. The bill contains certain exceptions, such as when an immediate threat to the officer's life or safety makes activating the camera impossible or dangerous. Yeah, I can see that coming up a whole bunch. Or when recording is discontinued at the request of a person seeking to remain anonymous. Agencies would be required to retain camera footage for at least 6 months and allow inspection by certain interested parties. Oh, good luck with that. It's hard enough to get FOIA requests through. Officers who fail to comply with the bill's requirements could be subject to disciplinary proceedings, and lack of footage could result in evidentiary presumptions against the government in criminal and civil cases. Subtitle would also require installation and use of video recording equipment in all federal patrol vehicles. That I could almost get behind. Good use of your tax dollars. Keep an eye on the cops. Part 2 of Subtitle C of the Justice and Policing Act, the Police Camera Act of 2020, would provide federal grants to expand use of body cameras by state, local, tribal law enforcement officers, subject to certain requirements related to safety, privacy, data retention, and reporting. Title 2 of the Justice Act would provide grants to state, local, and tribal enforcement agencies to support the use of body-worn cameras by law enforcement officials. Funding recipients would be required to provide assurances, oh I love that in quotes, that they have specified policies and procedures in place, including requiring certain training and imposing discipline on officers who fail to use cameras as required. Unlike the Justice and Policing Act, the Justice Act would not require the use of body cameras or cameras in patrol vehicles by federal law enforcement officers. Okay, Senate, I don't get you. Maybe you're in somebody's pocket a little bit more tightly than the House. Alright, both bills contain provisions designed to enhance transparency concerning records of misconduct by law enforcement. Sections 201 and 202 of the Justice and Policing Act would create a National Police Misconduct Registry maintained by the Department of Justice. Oh, that totally is not a conflict of interest now, is it? The publicly available registry would contain information including complaints, particularly those involving force or racial profiling, discipline records, termination records for all federal, state, local law enforcement officers. The bill would require states that receive certain federal funding to report such information on behalf of each law enforcement agency within the state. It would also require funding recipients to demonstrate that all law enforcement officers of the state or other jurisdiction have completed all state certification requirements. Title 3 of the Justice Act requires state and local governments to receive certain federal funding to maintain a system for sharing disciplinary records of law enforcement officers that meet certain specifications. That's nice and vague. The system would be accessible to other law enforcement agencies, and individual officers would have the ability to access their own records and submit related information. Before hiring any law enforcement officer, covered agencies would be required to search the system and review any records related to that officer. That would be nice. That I could kind of see. But again, I don't know if I want to pay tax money for the database. Anti-lynching provisions. Really? Who's been lynched? Okay. Title 4 of the Justice and Policing Act is referred to as both the Justice for Victims of Lynching Act and the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act. Title 4 of the Justice Act is entitled the Justice for Victims of Lynching Act. I feel like this is from the 60s. Okay, sorry. Maybe this is still happening. I'm not trying to be ignorant. Both bills would create a new section of the Federal Criminal Code entitled Lynching. The provision in each bill would criminalize conspiring to violate certain federal criminal rights, civil rights, or hate crime statutes. Violations will be punishable by a fine up to 10 years in prison or longer if authorized by the underlying statute the defendant conspired to violate. Alright, I'm not going to go down the lynching rabbit hole because I'm kind of like sitting here going, would this be for everyone or just the people that actually did the thing, or... I don't know, I feel like there's other laws that already cover this, but I had to look up a while ago because I had no idea what, like, why did they call it lynch? And apparently it's named after a certain guy, so there you are. Kind of like Lyme disease being named after a town, not something you think of. Unless you're bored like me and are sitting there going, it seems like such a strange word for that. There's no like Greek or Latin for it. Doesn't make sense. So you go and look things up because you're a librarian and you're bored. Anyway, let's see. Training, best practices, accreditation. Both bills seek to establish best practices for law enforcement officers and train officers in areas such as use of force and racial bias. Both bills would also create standards to accredit or otherwise identify law enforcement agencies that meet certain standards. Subtitle B of the Title I of the Justice and Policing Act, the Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Act of 2020, would require the Attorney General to develop uniform standards for accreditation of law enforcement agencies with respect to, among other areas, use of force procedures, stop and search procedures, training, early warning systems. The subtitle would direct the Attorney General to make policies to encourage law enforcement agencies to pursue accreditation. It would also authorize grants to community-based organizations to study and implement effective standards and programs for law enforcement agencies. Oh my god, it sounds like more bureaucracy and more government. Libertarian no-ness. Alright. Section 361 of the Justice and Policing Act would mandate training for federal law enforcement officers in racial profiling, implicit bias, and the duty to intervene when another officer is using excessive force. This section would also mandate that certain federal grant recipients require state and local law enforcement officers within their jurisdictions to complete such training. Title VI of the Justice Act would direct the Attorney General to develop training on alternatives to use of force, tactics for de-escalation, responding to behavioral health crises, and duty to intervene when another officer uses excessive force. The title will require the Attorney General to publish information about state and local law enforcement agencies that employ officers who have completed such training. Subtitle B of the Title VIII of the Justice Act would provide authorization and funding for the Director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture to develop and disseminate an educational curriculum for law enforcement personnel or candidates on the history of racism in the United States. Okay, so we're tossing some money over to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Okay. Guess we can't knock that. Cultural heritage is important. Pointing on the use of force or other matters, multiple provisions of both bills would facilitate federal data collection and oversight related to police reform. Section 117 of the Justice and Policing Act would establish a DOJ task force on law enforcement oversight to coordinate the detection and referral of complaints regarding alleged law enforcement misconduct. Section 118 of the Justice and Policing Act required federal law enforcement agencies, state, local, and tribal enforcement agencies that receive certain federal funding to report on various practices, including stop, searches, use of deadly force. Data on each covered practice would be broken down based on race, ethnicity, age, and gender of the officers and members of the public involved in each incident. Really? You're going to go around and ask everybody what race they do? Okay. Title 2, Subtitle B of the Justice and Policing Act, the PRIDE Act, would require recipients to certain federal funding to report to the Attorney General information about a broad range of incidents related to the use of force by and against law enforcement officers, including shootings, deaths in custody, and any incident involving death or arrest of a law enforcement officer. Reports would include various demographic information of the members of the public involved in such incidents. The subtitle would explicitly require reporting of such incidents involving school resource officers. Okay. The bill would direct the Attorney General to issue a public report containing data collected under this section. Yeah, that sounds like something that can be really easily manipulated because, again, we're like external people collecting demographic data. Is the demographic data report it, or are we looking at people and just making judgments? Seems like a mess. Alright, Section 101 of the Justice Act, the George Floyd and Walter Scott Notification Act, would require recipients of certain federal funding to report to the federal government information related to law enforcement use of force involving death, serious injury, or use of a firearm. So every single time a gun goes off, we're going to be sending it. Oh my gosh. Alright. Shootings of officers by civilians, okay, that's important, and other incidents related to the death or serious injury of an officer. Section 102 of the Justice Act, the Breonna Taylor Notification Act, would require federal funding recipients to report to the federal government information related to law enforcement uses of no-knock warrants. This section would also direct the Attorney General to publish an annual report on the use of no-knock warrants in closed investigations by federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. Okay, that I would like to see, if it comes out and is easily available. Alright, law enforcement demographics. Both bills contain provisions designed to promote hiring of law enforcement officers who live and demographically represent the communities they serve. Section 366 of the Justice and Policing Act would, among other things, authorize the use of certain federal funds to recruit law enforcement officers who live in or are willing to relocate to communities where there are poor or fragmented relationships between police and residents of the community, or where there are high incidents of crime. We convince people to go to Muskegon Heights. Will you move to Muskegon Heights? Are you open-minded and inclusive enough to give it a go? Anyway. Section 801 of the Justice Act would authorize the use of certain federal grant funding for a law enforcement agency that has a substantially different racial and ethnic demographic makeup than the community served by the agency to hire recruiters and enroll law enforcement officer candidates in law enforcement academies to become career law enforcement officers who have the racial and ethnic demographic characteristics similar to the community. Okay, I kind of like that you're trying to recruit people, but I don't know if you necessarily need to, like, hire recruiters and all that jazz. You just need to go out and, I don't know, make people want to be cops. Show how great it is to be a cop. Alright, provisions unique to Justice in Policing Act, which again is the House side. Criminal liability for civil rights violations. As discussed in more detail in the sidebar, provision of the Federal Criminal Code, Section 18 of the USC, Section 242, makes it a crime for government actors such as a law enforcement officer to willfully deprive a person of rights under Constitution or federal law, or to impose different punishments based on a person's race. Section 101 of the Justice and Policing Act would amend Section 242 to change the mental state required for conviction from willfully to the less stringent knowingly or recklessly. Gray areas, more gray. The section would also remove the possibility of a death sentence for violating Section 242. Okay, that's kind of good. Probably shouldn't be putting people to death, even though they're racists. Section 363 of the Act would amend Section 242 to provide that the application of any pressure to the throat or windpipe, use of maneuvers that restrict blood or oxygen flow to the brain, or carotid artery restraints, which prevent or hinder breathing or reduce intake of air, is a punishment that may not be imposed based on race. I don't think it was a punishment based on race to begin with. It has more to do with you acting up. As discussed in the sidebar, the judicially created doctrine of qualified immunity provides government officials performing discretionary functions generally may not be sued for such actions unless they violate clearly established law. Oh, there's another fun terms. Section 102 of the Justice and Policing Act would limit qualified immunity for state and local law enforcement officers in suits under 42 of the USC Code Section 1983 and for federal law enforcement officers in any action under a source of law provided there is not a defense to liability if a defendant believed in good faith that his or her conduct was lawful or the rights of the defendant allegedly infringed were not clearly established. Okay, that's... Qualified immunity provides government officials may not be sued. Okay. Someone, lawyer people, my brain is going. Feel free to explain that to me. So they would limit qualified immunity. Basically, you wouldn't be as immune. Okay, civil rights investigations. I discussed in the sidebar. DOJ has the authority under 34 of the United States Constitution Code, United States Code, Section 12601, to investigate any pattern or practice of constitutional violations by law enforcement agencies and sue to remedy such violations. Section 103 of the Justice and Policing Act would seek to enhance federal investigations into patterns and practices of law enforcement misconduct by granting subpoena power to DOJ under Section 12601 and authorizing the State Attorney General to bring suit based on violations of that provision. This section would also provide federal grant funding to enhance state and local investigations into potential patterns and practices of constitutional violations. Okay. Use of force investigations. States and States and state and local law enforcement agencies may also investigate potential law enforcement misconduct. However, some commentators are worried that close relationships between law enforcement officers and prosecutors may hinder investigations and prosecutions of law enforcement misconduct. Section 104 of the Justice and Policing Act would provide federal grant funding to enhance independent investigations into use of deadly force by state, local, and tribal law enforcement officers. Racial profiling. Title III, Subtitle A of the Justice and Policing Act, the End Racial and Religious Profiling Act, would seek to prevent and remedy racial profiling by law enforcement. Part 1, the subtitle will prohibit racial profiling by federal, state, local, and tribal law enforcement. The bill would define racial profiling as a law enforcement agent or agency relying to any degree on actual perceived race, ethnicity, national origin, religion, gender identity, or sexual orientation in assigning the scope and substance of law enforcement activities. To enforce this prohibition, the Act would authorize civil suits for declaratory or injunctive relief by the DOJ or affected individuals. Ooh, civil suits. Ooh, the ability to get money. Okay. It would suffice to show a violation of the bill if spontaneous investigatory activities of law enforcement agents in a jurisdiction have had a disparate impact on a covered group. It suffices to show a violation of the bill. Okay. I think what that's saying is you could show the violation if like random activities actually have like a disparate impact on like black people or whatever. It's kind of the profiling thing. Part 2 would require federal law enforcement agencies to establish policies to help eliminate racial profiling. Which, racial profiling I don't think is meant to necessarily be racist, just has racist consequences. It's just the human nature of like, this person looks like this, and we have a lot of people that look like that that do a thing. And therefore, you know, stereotypes are there for a reason. We're all dumb monkeys. Our brains just make shorter connections that way. Not to say you shouldn't resist them. Let's not take that out of context. Alright. And the remainder of Title III, Subtitle A, will provide funding for the training of state and local police and data collection related to racial profiling, and require the Attorney General to make annual reports to Congress on racial profiling by law enforcement agencies. Oh, I'm sure that's what Congress wants to sit and think about. Alright, restrictions on transfer of military equipment. Under a federal program known as the 1033 program, federal government transfers excess military equipment to state and local law enforcement agencies. Yeah, I love that, but then again, I'm the person that wants to allow you to privately auction off tanks. That's just me. Section 365 of the Justice and Policing Act, the Stop Militarizing Law Enforcement Act, would limit the transfer of certain military-grade equipment, primarily weapons and vehicles designed for combat, to state and local law enforcement. See, that could be interesting, because a lot of the stuff, like, I know it looks bad, it has bad visuals, but if you're like trying to get into a riot, sometimes you need some of that like crazy tank-like gear in order to quell stuff. I don't know. Mixed feelings. Alright, provisions unique to the Justice Act. New criminal offenses. Justice Act would create 2 new criminal offenses related to law enforcement oversight and reform. Section 106 would create a new criminal offense of knowingly and willfully falsifying a report in furtherance of the deprivation of any rights, privileges, or immunities secured or protected by the Constitution or laws of the United States where death or serious bodily injury occurs. Okay, so yeah, if you falsify a report that deprives other people's rights, or if someone dies, penalty for violating be a fine and imprisonment up to 20. Title 10 of the Justice Act would impose criminal liability when the person acting under color of law knowingly engages in a sexual act with a person in federal custody. Okay, this would be nice, because we all know a lot of people are getting abused in federal custody. Violation of this provision would be punishable by a fine and or up to 15 years in prison. It would also authorize grants to state municipalities and Indian tribes that enact similar laws. Alright, exploratory commissions. Justice Act would create 2 commissions to investigate issues and propose reforms in areas related to law enforcement oversight. Title V would create a commission on the social status of black men and boys to conduct a systematic study of the conditions affecting black men and boys, including homicide rates, arrest and incarceration rates, poverty, violence, fatherhood, mentorship, drug abuse, death rates, disparate income and wealth levels, school performance in all grade levels, including post-secondary education, college, and health issues. Composed of 19 members, including members of Congress and individuals appointed by Congress, the President, and certain executive branch officials, the commission would document trends in these areas and propose measures to address any issues it recorded. Oh, good. We need another 19-person commission. Oh, yeah. Alright, spread the pork around. Spread the pork around. I can already tell you the social status of black men and boys, not good. Alright. Title VII would establish a temporary National Criminal Justice Commission to undertake a comprehensive review of the criminal justice system. Good luck with that. Disseminate findings and propose reforms. President Leader of the Senate would each appoint a co-chair of a 14-person commission, and each co-chair would appoint 6 additional members. Okay, so is that 12 additional members or 6 combined? Okay, we're just gonna make mathies. I guess we'll do 12. Consultation with certain members of Congress. Okay, so we have 19 and 14, so that's 23. And then we have 6, that's 29, and then another 6, that's 35. Okay, we're up to 35 people now. Title IX would direct the National Criminal Justice Commission to develop best practices related to law enforcement oversight. It would also direct the Commission to conduct studies on state and local use of force review boards, officer training, and issues related to mental health and addiction, improving accountability for DOJ grants. Okay, and then we're down to the author information, Joanna R. Lampe. Thank you for sharing all this with us. I know we're almost at half an hour, but yeah, I forgot which one of these passed. I should probably go look that up, but in the meantime, now we get some idea of what the difference between the two was. And hopefully you found it as interesting as I did. Yeah. I don't know. I'm not for creating more commissions. Too much government as is.